the storage they can do will be there, etc. Then by 2030, the total amount of demand for water will be actually 50% higher than the total amount of supply. Now, when people say that, what they really mean is business as usual is not feasible, because this demand has to be met. If it is not met, GDP won't grow, production won't take place, and so on. So how is that going to be met? Well, some of it can be met by doing a better job of harnessing available water. But doing a better job actually means doing it a little differently. But a very large part, maybe 80%, has to be met through greater efficiency, improvements in water use efficiency. Now, the present position is that about 80% of the water we need is actually used in agriculture. And the second thing is that this use is highly inefficient in the sense that with available modern techniques, if we shift to techniques of farming which enable you to increase the efficiency of water use, it is possible to achieve 40 to 50% reduction in the requirement of water. But remember, to do that requires an agricultural transformation. Farmers, and there are millions of them involved, farmers have to do things differently. It's not just a question of having the money to make the change needed. It's actually a huge mindset change. I mean, we have traditionally said that our farmers know everything, that the traditional wisdom of the farmers is so enormously overpowering that really we don't need to tell them very much else. But you know, I don't think you're going to achieve a 40% increase in efficiency or reduction in water use just by relying on traditional methods. What is actually important is that we build on traditional methods and move the existing system to the extent to which it is possible, but very dramatically in the direction of greater efficiency of water use. Now that's as far as agriculture is concerned. But you know, we have a huge job to do in terms of the non-agricultural demand for water, because we have a situation at the moment where most of our cities have been organizing their search for water very much on the assumption that harnessing the available nearby local water sources is not actually very important. For example, unplanned urbanization actually means that all the water courses and so on in and around urban areas get dramatically altered. You don't get the recharge that you should be getting. You don't conserve the water that's actually falling. Local water bodies disappear. Real estate development takes over, et cetera, and the city looks for water further and further away. So if you look at what cities are doing, they are basically trying to get water from 50 kilometers away, 100 kilometers away, in some cases more than 100 kilometers. They're very expensive, laying down pipes, all the usual problems of leakages, etc., and all very energy intensive. And I think this is the other thing we must keep in mind, that in the next 20 years, energy is going to become more expensive and not less expensive. So really, the rethinking of the whole approach to water is a very comprehensive element of planning that is needed. One of the issues, two other issues that I want to focus on. I mean, one is that the present situation is very much one in which we don't observe a very elementary principle, which is that if the urban area is going to take water, fresh water from a freshwater source, then it should be returning water in a reasonably fresh sort of way back to the same source. I mean, normal flow of water will do some cleaning on its own. So it doesn't have to be returned at drinking water levels, but it has to be returned to the freshwater source in a manner that doesn't actually seriously damage, actually not damage the river at all. This is not being done anywhere. the whole focus is that the city needs water and the city returns sewage. This actually is a perfectly reasonable thing if the number of people in relation to this flow of water is small. Because nature does a lot of cleaning. Sunlight does a lot of cleaning on inflowing water. But when you have 17, 18 million people in Delhi pulling out water from the Yamuna and returning sewage, it is quite unfair to expect nature to be solving that problem. I think it's the city of Delhi that must solve that problem. Now, I've seen in some of the papers that are presented here that a number of engineering solutions have been put forward. You know, from an engineering point of view, this is not an impossible problem. And there are many ways of, there are some problems, there are many ways of tackling the problem. But there is actually an economic problem. That, you know, if you're going to take water, fresh water, from a freshwater source, and you're going to be otherwise returning dirty water, the cost of cleaning that water so that what you return is consistent with ecological demands, that should be part of the price that is paid for the water system. This is not being done anywhere. I mean, the present position is that even the drinking water that people get in cities, they're not even paying for the operation and maintenance cost of the plants that are used in order to make the water clean. Forget about the capital cost. Now, in this environment, what you get is a big pressure that, look, we obviously need a lot of investment, and one of the subjects of this seminar is, can we bring in private sector? As a general strategy, we have been strongly arguing in the Planning Commission that we should be quite willing to bring in private investment where public investment would be saved. And you have to create the conditions in which the private sector can invest. Now, obviously, the private sector can only invest if there's a revenue model that will actually pay. And the payment has not got to be just the payment for the cost of bringing the drinking water. It also has to be payment for the cost of cleaning the sewage before it's returned to the river. So actually the cost of the water must include the cost of the treatment of sewage. And if you're going to bring in the private sector, the responsibility for returning cleaned water must be part of the contract. This is not difficult to do in the sense that it can simply be made part of the contract and enforced. But what it will do is it will drive home the fact that the city and or the government must somehow pay for it, what the first part of the city is paying. And the first part of the city isn't paying for the sewerage anyway. And in that first part of the city, there's a highly unequal system of distribution where the better off parts of the city actually get more water and the poorer parts don't get water. Now, this has led to a huge reaction on the part of civil society. I don't know if there are representatives of civil society in this seminar, but you know, I would really urge that while I do believe that the technical side of tackling the water problem is extremely important, also the economic side of providing a revenue model that works is extremely important. The civil society side of assuaging the fears that civil society has are also extremely important. And I'll tell you what their basic fear is. I think their basic fear is that we do not have a revenue model which is going to ensure if you hand over the distribution of the water to a private company, then the incentive of that private company will obviously be to provide the most water where the most tariff is going to be realized. Now, I know very well, and many of our cities do that, and we say that in the plan also. It's completely logical to, for example, have a system of lifeline tariffs where a minimum required amount per family, per household, whatever, is provided at a very low tariff, and the entire burden of cost is then spread to the others. Now, in that system, people who are poorer are assured of a minimum amount of water, and then basically those who want more water pay for it. The fear that civil society has is that what will actually happen is that nobody will be very interested in actually delivering water to those parts of the city that are actually going to be at the low price band. Now, this is very easy to take care of. I mean, it simply means, you know, as long as you can enforce that in the distribution of water, the minimum amount, which is very low priced, is actually made available. Then beyond that, extra water yields the same revenue whether it goes to the poorer parts or to the richer parts. But you know, the kind of contract arrangements that have to be worked out are very complex. And one of the problems in the present system is that people typically partition the city. And the private contracting and the private-public partnership is restricted to those parts of the city which are going to have paying customers. So the basic assumption is that the private sector will look after the rich and the public sector will look after the poor. Nothing wrong with that either. But the suspicion then is that the private sector will shift, that the system will shift water to the private sector, and what the public sector is giving to the poor will simply be ignored. And I think I've talked to a lot of civil society organizations, and remember, water is a fundamental, most people view water as a fundamental right. And therefore, any water solution that does not get the support from a broad range of civil society is simply doomed to failure. Doomed to failure in the sense that you can work it out here, there, and everywhere, and that'll be very nice. But it is not going to solve, we will not have a workable solution. And I do believe, by the way, that it's possible. But it's only possible if the public-private partnership contractual models that are laid out and also the obligations that are placed on the private distributor are made very, very clear and are very, very policeable. I mean, supervisable, enforceable. This can be done, and I do think that those arrangements should be open for public discussion. And it will be a bit time-consuming, and very often it takes a long time to get over suspicion. But that's a very important part of the whole thing. Now, underlying this is the issue of financing. You know, as far as the private supplier is concerned, a business model works if you're paying them, if you're allowing them to charge a certain amount and paying them, charging from them a reasonable amount for the water they get. But as I said, there are two additional issues here. One is that it's very important that the sewerage part of it should be made part of the whole system, and that is not generally done. If the sewerage part of it is not made part of the private concession, but is done by, let us say, some public enterprise, then the cost of that has to be built into the cost charged for water. I mean, there is no way of charging people for the sewerage systems that they get. And since 90% of the water that they take in goes back into the sewerage, it's perfectly logical to load it onto the water, to the intake itself. And that pricing has not been done and needs to be worked out. Now, I think what very often, the private sector is not actually interested in what you charge the customer. The private sector is interested in being able to get a total return. So they would be quite happy if you want to keep charges low, but for every kiloliter pumped into the system, the government pays an extra amount. But you know, this assumption that it's easier that for urban areas, the assumption that the government, whether it's the local government, state government, or the central government, the government should cover the cost of non-lifeline water, I mean, this is really highly questionable. It's a classic case, it's a private good. People who are using water are benefiting from it. And I doubt very much that any central or state government will be capable of bearing that charge. And there's a serious danger that what happens is that basically you set up these expensive facilities, and slowly the financial support that is needed from either the local body or the state